So I'd like to start off with an easy question for our panelist here. Why are you in this work? We'll start with Mara.
I have to be. I think I'll leave it at that. I just absolutely have to be.
What would happen if you weren't?
I just can't imagine it. I'm sorry to be troublesome so early in the panel, but
there's always one on a panel.
It is a
Thank you.
It is a personal imperative.
Personal imperative. Thank you. Keith.
I'm in this work because I have realized over time that nothing is preordained, especially now as we look at what's happening in our country, the imperiled state in which we are in, the challenge to fundamental principles and values of our nation. This work is imperative because it is only through this kind of work that we can achieve justice and equality and live up to the base principles of America.
Thank you. Fatima.
I'm almost with Mara. I mean, this work is personal. I would be doing this work whether I was at the National Women's Law Center or not. I think I was doing this work before I knew I was doing this work. I mean, it is urgent, it is personal, and the work that we are doing is working to improve people's lives, and it feels more urgent than ever before.
Great, thank you. Rebecca.
Because today is my 40th birthday. And
Happy birthday.
And I've been doing this work for 20 years now. And I can tell you that still today, if disabled people are not at the table, they sit on the menu, not just by our enemies, but by our friends.
Great, thank you. Jonah.
Well, happy birthday.
Thank you.
And what an incredible panel. Amen to everything that's been said, and I will only add that the Leadership Conference for Civil and Human Rights is the most important community. God put us in this place at this moment in time for a reason, and we at the Religious Action Center of Reform Judaism always proudly remind people that the Leadership Conference, its first office is here in Washington, we're in our offices in DuPont Circle, and that's why the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act that Vanita referenced earlier were actually drafted in our conference room. And we in the Jewish community have been showing up for justice for 5,000 years since we marched out of Egypt. And we will show up for 5,000 more years if that's what it takes.
Great. Jonah, I'd like to ask you a follow-up question. Last year in September, you co-authored an op-ed in the Washington Post with Reverend Dr. William Barber, and you included an interesting line that jumped out at me, and it said that we must hold ourselves to a higher moral bar. What do you mean by that?
Thank you for the question, and it's an honor to be Reverend Barber's sojourner in this work. What he and I think meant was that we need to turn the mirror of injustice on ourselves, on our communities, on our congregations, and our institutions. 3 very specific examples. We have done a deep dive into the racism and white supremacy even within the Reformed Jewish movement. We are a majority white denomination of Judaism, although about 10% of Jews in America now are of color. And we've really tried to do a deep dive into racial justice work within to ask the questions about how we are both perpetuating systems of white supremacy and excluding the Jews of color among us and oppressing them inadvertently in ways that make us hypocrites as we fight for racial justice externally. We need to live our values internally. I would just briefly add also, when we became the first major religious denomination in America to take on trans equality, we said we have to make sure that our synagogues are equitable and loving and embracing of trans people, not just schools and the military. And then finally, pay equity. We realize the same patterns of inequality in pay according to gender happen within our own congregations as happening in the world at large. So we got to fight within in addition to fighting beyond.
Great, thank you. Mara, the question to you is, why are all of you here during this time? Why is it important for all of these groups to be at the table in this civil and human rights fight?
Well, we're all under attack. So I'm going to interpret your question to mean, why are we all working together? And I look at a little bit of data from our survey of 28,000 transgender people we did a few years ago, and we saw that a quarter of our folks didn't go to the doctor last year when they needed to because they were afraid of being disrespected or discriminated against. But a third, 10% more, didn't go because they couldn't afford it. Sometimes when you're transgender, the biggest transgender problem you're facing is poverty. Sometimes the biggest transgender issue you're facing as a transgender person is racism. Sometimes it's the economy. Sometimes it's all these different things. So we know that we can't be an effective transgender movement or an organization if we aren't also an anti-racist movement, a pro-worker movement, pro-disability rights movement, pro-women movement, et cetera. The leadership conference is a way to make that real. As trans people have been attacked this last 2 years so viciously by this administration, every time we're attacked and we stand up, we look and the National Women's Law Center is next to us, the RAC's next to us, LCCR is next to us, the Muslim advocates are next to us. So when there's a Muslim ban, we're there. When they try to defund Planned Parenthood, we're there. It is how to be both moral, but also very importantly, how to be effective.
Great. Quick question, Rebecca. You mentioned that cross-movement solidarity is our only means for survival. What do you mean by that?
You know, I think Mara just gave such a great example of that, and I can tell you that our people exist across all of our movements. You know, whether it be disabled folks. I mean, we know that roughly 1 in 4 people are people with disabilities. So while I'm sitting on this stage as one of 5 panelists, there are probably at least 20 of my people in this room, and probably more of you that don't disclose, but you affiliate with other civil rights movements. If we don't stand together in these times, I mean, I think one of the biggest examples that I can think of is last summer when we saw the conversation around the Masterpiece Cake Shop case. We saw the Muslim ban. We saw HR 620 in the disability community. We saw all of these attempts to push people that this administration sees as different, deviant, or less than to the margins of society and to actually block us from accessing society. And I think every time that happened, we came together as a coalition and said all means all.
Great, thank you. Fatima, what is the biggest impediment facing this civil rights movement right now? What is the biggest obstacle that's stopping us from realizing our goals? It's an easy question. I save that for you.
Softball.
So I would say there's 2 types of things. One is structural, right? I actually think for some people, they thought in 2016, white supremacy just became a thing, or misogyny just became a thing. It was revealed, right? And sometimes it's helpful to see the structures that are really underlying the oppression that people are experiencing. So that is the upside of this period. But I will say, I'm going to reframe your question a bit. One of the things that I think is most challenging right now about what we are facing is the pace and the intensity and the chaotic nature of the attacks that we are facing across all of our issues, across all of our communities. And that puts a tremendous strain on people's ability to actually notice, identify, and address the many attacks that we're facing. It puts a strain on people. You know, I don't know how many people over the last few weeks who've said, I just feel like I need a break. I'm going to stop watching TV. I'm going to turn it off so I don't know what's happening. But it's still happening. And that is an on-purpose strategy. That sort of chaotic and intense and unrelenting attacks designed to sort of tear us all down across all of our issues, across all of our communities. So that, I think, is the biggest thing that we are facing right now. It is that these systems have been revealed and they are coming at us intensely, and we cannot look away.
So let me ask this question. This is a panel-wide question, whoever wants to jump in. What is the state of the civil rights movement the day after the last day of this administration? What condition are we in? Are we burnt out? Has everyone fled? Are we just too worn down to press ahead? What is the state of the movement then?
This is after the leadership conference holds a huge party. I don't know what the meeting is. But there is a mandate for that.
I would say, first of all, we should say that I'm going to presume for this question that's 2020, not 2024. And I think that's a reasonable presumption in light of the very important midterm elections. And let me just say a word about that. Trump is an autocrat. The only reason we haven't moved closer to autocracy is because of the systems in place in the United States that are not in place in other places. I mean, if you look at Erdogan in Turkey, or Orban, or Putin, or Duterte, he shares those values. But we have a system that is held. The reason this midterm election was so vital is that when autocrats win elections after they've taken steps towards autocracy, then they double down. And this is a line in the sand, and I think it is a rejection of Trump and Trumpism and its vulgarity and its mendacity. 2020, when Trump is out and there is a sane president in the White House, I think it's a matter of re-engaging and defining objectives and coming up with strategic plans to achieve those objectives. It's the time for action. And I think that we will be tired because of the battle of this last 4 years, but it is time to redouble our efforts to make this a more just society.
Can I jump in?
Please.
One of the things that I think is interesting is, first off, I want to be very clear and say when it comes to that person that resides at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, it's not a question of sanity or insanity. He is a bad person, he is an evil person, and labeling it and tying it to mental health is extremely damaging to my community. And that's not okay, and we as a collective civil rights base have to stop doing that. We can call, I like to use the same term that President Obama used for Kanye. He's a jackass. He's not one of our people. We don't claim him, nor will we. The day after.
Wait, you talking about Kanye or the president?
Either one of them. But I do think it's really important to note that, let's be honest, the system we had before Trump wasn't working so great for marginalized folks either.
Right. That's right.
And so it's not enough to just say we're going to, go back to the way things were. I honestly think that we have an opportunity to look at some of these issues. How is systemic racism integrated into the structures in our country? Why is it that disabled people can't work and have health care? Why is it that we continue to place restrictions on the ability of trans folks to live the lives that they want to lead? And how can we go back and make this a better America for Americans, for all Americans?
I mean, I totally agree with you, Rebecca. I mean, one of the things that has emerged in this period that has been, frankly, beautiful is the activism primarily led by women. And it is strong. It is not going away. It won't be like, oh, Trump's gone.
Yeah,
Exactly. No, people have been awakened in ways that are so interesting, and it is personal, and it is showing up in all sorts of ways. It's showing up digitally with Me Too. It's showing up with people challenging their workplaces, and it's showing up for the highest numbers of women elected to Congress in history. So I actually think that planning, that strategy work, that real vision of work about that asking that question of what does it actually take to live and work with equity and dignity and safety and bodily autonomy, that starts now. That started before. And so people will be ready with plans. And there may be some tiredness, and so I believe in people tapping in and tapping out. We're going to need to do that. But there's no slowdown in 2020. Mm-hmm. That is the time to put that plan into action.
Yes. May I jump in? Oh, please. Sorry.
Yeah, I just want to follow up on what Fatima just said. It's the difference between 20 and 24 is really, really important. And we need to understand and we need to absorb that it is easier to win re-election than it is to get elected in the first place. We cannot go into 2020 thinking, oh my God, everybody hates him, nobody will re-elect him. He has a big advantage in 2020. And the difference between his administration ending in 2021 and 2025 is is catastrophically different. It's 4 more years of degradation of our society, of our laws, of our environment. It will be harder in 2025 than in 2021, and we really need to make sure that we're all buttoned down, and I say this in a totally nonpartisan way, that we make sure the elections go the way that individuals believe they should go.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
I would echo that and go back to the original question, which is the health of the civil rights movement, right? That's the real question, because waves don't happen. We organize waves. We're going to hear from Desmond Meade in a few minutes. I got to tell you, a year ago, Desmond came to meet with me in Boca Raton, Florida, and propositioned that we might engage the synagogues across Florida. We have a nice base in Florida. I don't know if people have noticed. Jewish community has a base, okay? We had Desmond and his allies move from synagogue to synagogue, Friday nights, giving the sermon, telling his story, talking about voting rights, and in a purely nonpartisan way, because we have a very diverse Jewish community. Thousands and thousands of Jewish people, mostly white, showed up with Desmond's coalition to win that ballot initiative. And it was because of an incredible coalition. We thought it was our thing. We didn't realize it was like all these groups across the spectrum, across lines of difference, coming together. That, to me, is the health of the civil rights movement. When it's Muslims and Christians and Jews and different advocacy organizations, all crossing lines of difference to come together to hold electeds accountable to our values and what we believe America ought to look like. That's when we win as a civil rights community.
Great, thank you. This is also a panel-wide question. Many times when we invoke the term civil rights or civil rights leader, there's a very crystallized idea that most people have in their heads of what a civil rights leader looks like. And they see grainy black and white footage and they hear speeches from podiums in their head. But what is a 2018 civil rights leader? Who is that now? Open to the panel.
Yeah, leadership comes from a lot of different places. And so I actually think if we have shed the idea that there is not one idea of who is a civil rights leader, then we're doing our job. I think if you look at the leadership of people in this movement, it is the leadership of the hundreds of members of the Leadership Conference of Civil and Human Rights, but it is also the leadership of activists around this country doing this work in community who are deep partners, and they are every age, and they are every religion, and every race, and every gender, and every sexual orientation, and gender identity. And I actually think we do a really giant disservice if we discount any type of leadership. So, and I'm ready to follow the leadership of, the 11-year-old girl who reminded us at the March for Our Lives that she'd be voting in 7 years, and all of us adults need to get our stuff together. So, I just think there's not one idea.
Other thoughts?
Yeah, I'd build on that and the image of that young leader at the March for Our Lives. I was reminded when I met David Goodman, Andrew Goodman's brothers, Cheney and Schwerner. David reminded me that when he was a little boy, he remembered when his older brother Andrew came home one day and asked his mother to sign the permission slip to allow him to go on Mississippi Summer. Wow. That's how young Goodman, Cheney, and Schwerner were. We nostalgize it, right? We kind of have this, there was danger and there was threat, and our young people led then, and our young people are leading us now. And what I'm so moved by is the students from Parkland who have organized not only their own base, but have met with teens right here in Washington, D.C., with teens in Chicago who understand the intersectionality, and that gun violence happens in these massacres in mostly white, affluent suburban districts from time to time, but they're a daily occurrence in some neighborhoods of color. And so they've built this kind of intersectional movement of young people to really challenge the gun violence plague in our country. That's, I think, where we will see the kind of new leadership that we need.
So let me ask you a question.
Actually, can I jump in?
Sorry,
on one
please.
thing? With this kind of panel, it's like, how can you not jump in? One of the things that I was thinking about is I imagine a civil rights leader that doesn't feel like they have to hold any part of themselves back to lead.
Yes.
I was talking to a colleague who's an activist in the immigration movement, who is very outspoken about the fact that he had just gotten his 20-year chip from AA, and he talks about it in his activism all the time. This colleague of mine also has an anxiety disorder. And so I said to him, I pulled what I like to call an Andy Imparato, because if you know Andy Imparato, he's probably challenged you with this sort of thing before. And what I said, I was like, okay, I'm like, every time I hear you speak, you talk about your chip. How about you try talking about your anxiety? And he looked at me and was like, what? And I was like, try it, see what happens. And I gave him the advice that I was given about talking about my own mental health disability, which is, when you bring your whole self to the table, it allows more people to see themselves in that movement. And so he talked about his anxiety and at a big immigration rally. And when he came off the stage, literally there were 100 young immigration activists, all there that had mental health disabilities and other disabilities, that said, I never thought I could bring that part of myself to the table. And I think it shows a real failing across all of our movements, that within each of our movements, our young activists are still feeling like they have to hold part of themselves back, instead of seeing it as part of the armor that they bring to the work that we all do.
Rebecca, one of the things that we see when we look back in the movement from the 50s and the 60s is that there was a tension between the young people and the so-called older people, even though they were in their early 30s. When you talk about SNCC and the SCLC, there were tensions there where they talked about the kids. And there was a fundamental question of how to integrate young people into the movement in a way that does not require them to hold back. How do we do that now?
Are you asking me this because I'm 40 now? Does that happen when you turn 40? Do all the answers come to you?
I just assume you were a young person.
Oh, yeah. Coming up in the disability rights movement, literally being born into this work, my dad ran a Center for Independent Living, and my mom ran a disabled student center at community college, and both of them were little people. I think there's a lot of structural work that we need to do within our communities. I think a lot of times we're seeing folks talk about young people's organizing as slacktivism, when for a lot of folks, it's hugely effective. Can you guys imagine organizing without Twitter or Facebook? Years ago, my colleague Erica Williams was on a stage very much like this at the State of the Black Union. And one of the things that Erica said was that the elders at the time kept talking about Facebook and Twitter and change.org and all of these things as just, like cool little toys that the young people invented. We would never talk about those things now. And so I think it's important to remember that innovation comes from our young people, and none of our movements would have ever succeeded if not on the labor, both paid and significantly unpaid, of our young people. And I think referring to them as young leaders is crap, because they're leaders. And the minute we start implying additional labels on that, we do that to keep them out of the tables of power. That's right. And what they're going to do, and what I tell them to do, is build your own tables and don't invite us.
Thoughts? Other thoughts?
I'm old. I completely agree with Rebecca.
Well, the only other thing that I would add, because I totally agree with Rebecca, but that sometimes I think that, and this conversation has been really rich within the women's community, and especially in the 2016 campaign, there was this narrative that younger women and older women had nothing in common. And I think that's just it oversimplifies things. That sometimes people are almost talking different languages, but if there are more and more opportunities to have intergenerational conversations and intergenerational work, I think we will be stronger across our movement.
And honestly, I think that's the role of the leadership conference. I mean, years ago, back in 2009, Wade and the crew took all of the membership organizations down to New Orleans for a week right after the election to organize. And it was a whole meeting, it was a phenomenal meeting on succession planning. And each member of the leadership conference came and had to bring next generation, because I'm not calling them young leaders, a next generation leader with them. And we had a lot of those conversations. But I think one of the things that was fascinating was how hesitant, with the exception of Wade, everybody was to have that succession planning conversation, which anybody that knows Wade knows it's not a surprise. I mean, he had talked about this for a long time, and it's one of the reasons I think that actually made him a really good ally to a lot of young people in the movement, was his willingness to have these conversations. And I think it is that, how do we pull folks together in a room and engage in that dialogue? That's so important to have going forward.
So Rebecca, I am happy to endorse any idea of taking a trip down to New Orleans. So thank you for bringing that up on stage.
Vanita,
I didn't pay you to do that.
At?
So Vanita, thank you for our trip to New Orleans. You raise an interesting question that I'd like to put out to the entire panel, and it is one of transition of power within the movement, right? A lot of times we're talking about power outside the movement, but we've had some power struggles within the movement. How can we get better with that? How can we be more thoughtful about this transition of power, being thoughtful about bringing in not just a new generation, but a new cohort of people who want to be involved in this movement?
Well, I've been at the National Women's Law Center for a very long time, for over a decade. It was founded in 1972, but I've been president around a year. And the leadership transition within our own organization was very much planned. It was, it wasn't sort of, and if you know us as an organization, that shouldn't surprise anyone that it was planned, but it was very much planned. And I think as movements, if we are to be movements that sustain for the long haul, and as organizations within movements, if we are going to continue to be organizations that sustain for the long haul, we have to be planning for that at all levels, right? We have to be growing leaders at a lot of different levels, and we have to be planning for transitions on purpose. It cannot just be that all of a sudden we look up and we say, we don't have a plan, and who is leading, and we don't know any of the people who are doing the most powerful and vibrant organizing in this country. That would be a giant mistake, and one that if you aren't continuing to grow and foster relationships and leaders, you will make.
Thank you. Other thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I would just invoke Reverend Barber again, and something he reminded me often when I travel. I went down to North Carolina, and I told the story of the Voting Rights Act being written in our conference room. And he stood up and he said, "Rabbi, let me correct you. The Voting Rights Act was not written in your conference room. It was written in blood in Selma and transcribed in your conference room." I carry that with me as a reminder to get with the grassroots and then get out of the way. I think all of the national organizations in this room, like mine, have to be really humbled by where our people are, where our power is at our base. For me, it's 900 congregations across North America. It's 2 million people who call themselves Reformed Jews, many of whom are under 18. Those are my people. We need to let them lead and then get out of the way of their leadership and harness what they are doing with us to take us where we need to be.
I think for the disability community, we're used to always having to expand our leadership because the definition of disability is always evolving. Whether it be Zika, whether it be conversations around postpartum depression, whether it be, I was in Ferguson 2 years ago talking to activists, and just as you have that line from Reverend Barber in your head, for me it was Tara T. in Ferguson who said to me on a panel, "Rebecca, I don't believe in PTSD." And I stopped and I looked at her and I was like, okay, wait, stop the panel. We need to delve into this. Like, Tara, where are you going? And what she said to me is, she's like, because there is no such thing as post. Post is a fallacy. She said, because as Black women in Ferguson, Missouri, we are constantly traumatized, stressed, and disordered. There is no, she's like, post is a fallacy. And it blew my mind in thinking about how the disability community thinks about who our constituency is. Because I had never thought about that. And the fact that we come to movement work, nobody comes to movement, okay, how many of you are in movement work because of no trauma at all? Okay, no, there's not a single hand up in the room. How many of you have acquired trauma as a result of movement work? So all of you, welcome to the disability community. We've actually been waiting for you for quite a while. The head of AAPD is up here, Helena Berger. She'll be glad to talk to you afterwards. But we're used to having to continue to expand our community because that's the reality. And so I think thinking about who is in our spaces as a fluid thing versus a structured thing, we have to do it if we're going to survive.
I'd like to follow up on that. Rebecca, our movement, as you know, is very much the same way. What is a transgender person has evolved in people's thinking, including our own. And I would say in the larger civil and human rights community, transgender people are a relatively new part We first approached the leadership conference around the turn of the century, this recent century. And I think it's a good model for how things should be. Frankly, there were people who were sort of surprised, kind of like, oh, what? We're this kind of people? We didn't expect this kind of people. Yeah. And we had to push a little, but it was always understood throughout the leadership conference and throughout all the organizations, as far as I know, that we were allowed to push, we were allowed to show up, we were allowed to step up and work with people. Going back to talking about younger activists, when I talk to young queer activists, I always like to tell them how things were 15 years ago. Mm-hmm. When I met with the minority leader in the Pennsylvania State Senate in 2001, and after he wouldn't do what we wanted, and we won anyway, he pulled me aside. I was the only transgender person in the delegation, and he said, but Mara, look at the bright side. 5 years ago, I wouldn't have let you in my office. And in 2004, I don't blame Senator Kerry or Secretary Kerry for this at all. I don't believe it was him. I believe it was his staff. I was on his LGBT leadership committee or whatever. They bent over backwards multiple times to keep me out of the same room with Senator Kerry because they could not risk having his picture taken with a transgender person. Now that seems absurd now, but it just shows the evolution. And I think how the leadership conference did it was a really good way, because we were in the middle of fights on the hate crimes bill and on the Employment Non-Discrimination Act. And I know there were people in the coalition, good, well-meaning people who were like, oh man, we got to change it again, and these new people are coming in. But they understood that they had to learn, and they had to figure it out, and they had to give us some space. And we pushed, and they yielded. And I'm very proud of everybody for that.
Can I say one more thing? I was just thinking about part of what you were saying, Rebecca, and I think that we cannot forget in this work to make space for healing as a part of our systems of accountability. And you guys are doing eloquent jobs of quoting people, and so I will not quote, but just take inspiration from Tarana Burke, who reminds me again and again that my understanding of what accountability really looks like is far too limited. And it's far too limited because we have been okay with systems that don't allow for healing. So I want to just keep pushing us.
So Fatima, can I follow up on that? What does it look like to have systems that leave space and room for healing?
Well, it's interesting. So I will tell you how I was thinking about it before, which was, way too tied up in the law, right? Way too tied up into, we need to change the rules, right? And we need to change how it is that we as organizations or whatever institution that allows violence and that allows a range of oppression to occur. How do we make them accountable, and how do we trigger them to act differently, right? And rules and laws are one way. If you actually flip that a little bit and center the experiences of people who are most harmed, and think about what does it look like for you to actually have justice and to heal, the answer may be very, very different, right? For them, healing may not be my version of the rules and laws. And so one of the things that is important for the work that we do, whether it is the work around survivors or beyond, is to really put at the center the people who are most experiencing the concern you were trying to address.
So can I ask a question for the group? What is the next frontier of the movement? What is the next challenge? What happens 10 years from now when Ashley is running the 20th anniversary of the Bend Toward Justice conference? What is this panel talking about? What are we wrestling with then?
Can I jump in on that question? I'm moved by the way Fatima kind of teed that up, because I think if we just win some bills, if we just pass some legislation, if we just kind of hold some electeds accountable, we will have lost.
Yeah.
I really do think there is the kind of question of the soul of this country. It is about confronting its history in a true and real way, in a way that's inclusive and brings people along. I think Mara's reminder about how important it is to kind of let people evolve and grow, to heal the community and heal the nation and be a model, a light unto the nations for all nations, about what a community of healing and inclusion and equity actually looks like when we don't just get more votes and push our thing through and then crush the other side, but model the kind of justice. Like, what would it look like if we modeled the kind of justice we fight for? If the electoral process, if the Congress, if our politics were as sacred and as human and as dignified as what we believe in? That would be transformational.
Okay, thank you.
One thing I think, and I agree with all that, absolutely. But one thing I think we will work on now and we will need to continue to work on is the growing delta between rich and poor. I mean, for the last 3.5 decades or so, we've had this growing delta. And we are seeing the results of that in, I think, our body politic, and it's quite unhealthy. And I think, you know, the same dynamics, people talk about the Rust Belt, but the same dynamics that are occurring on the Rust Belt are occurring in the inner city, or occurring on reservations, where you have some people who are year after year gaining the great benefits of our economic system, and many, many people that are on the losing end of that. And if we don't find a way to fundamentally restructure the way things work, I think we're just going to continue to go down this path of division that is quite unhealthy for our society. And it's not just happening here, it's a worldwide phenomenon, because we are switching from a industrial economy to an information economy. And with that change, you need different rules for your economic system, not dissimilar than when we went from a mercantile agricultural economy into an industrial one. So I hope this movement, and I hope entities like the Leadership Conference of Civil Rights, who has led on this issue, will continue to lead on this issue, because I think it is an issue that can unify this country in ways that others can't.
Right, thank you.
Remember that the rules breaking down, which seems to be happening, can be a good thing or a bad thing, right? There was a really neat story a couple days ago that you probably all saw about moms who are in Congress wanting to take their kids onto the floor of the House, and people are like, but there's never been kids on the floor of the House. Well, I mean, who really ultimately cares except parents who want to bring their kids onto the floor of the House? That's not the most important rule that's breaking down, but a lot of our societal rules are breaking down, a lot of our cultural rules are breaking down. And we can either look at that as a tragedy, and in many cases it is. We can also look at it as this amazing opportunity. As the environment, our physical world is also breaking down in some really dangerous ways, and our economic system is bifurcating people in some really dangerous ways. What are the rules that we have to be part of making? The rabbi's right, we can't just pass a bill or two here or there and think we've made a success. When the rules are changing, we have to be part of making the rules. They have to be more just rules, they have to be more practical rules, and they have to be rules that we want to live with. And so I think the rules are really an important part that sometimes we don't focus on enough.
I'd like to ask a question for the group, because all of you have invoked the term justice, or you've talked about what is just. Has the civil and human rights movement ceded the ground on morality? So obviously there's more discussion about saying what is moral and what is amoral. But over the course of the history of the United States, the law has been weaponized against people of color and women. Scripture has been weaponized against women and people of color. The economy has been weaponized against women and people of color. The criminal justice system, the list goes on, and all of them have been weaponized by people with an amoral agenda. So the question is, have we ceded that ground, and is there a way of taking that back?
It's interesting. I actually think that's one of the things that's really important that's happening right now is that culturally you are seeing tremendous shifts and rejection of things that are harmful to people across communities. And I do think that undergirding that is some sense of what is and is not good, what is and is not fair, what is and is not just. And so that cultural work and those cultural conversations, I actually think are what in part are sustaining our work right now, right? Because we have been in this period for a couple of years where it has been the people power in the courts and not a lot else that has been helping us. And that the people power piece of it, having a clear sense of this is wrong, naming it immediately, showing up powerfully and collectively, even when you don't have anything individually at stake, or you think you don't have anything individually at stake. So I actually don't think in this moment that the civil rights community is ceding any ground. I actually think the civil rights community is surrounding that, and that is the leadership that has been the most exciting in this period.
Oh, go ahead, please. I think that's eloquently put, and I agree with it. I would add that, I think that these constructs, whether it's justice or liberty or what have you, it is always going to be an eternal battle to define what that means. It always has been in this country, and it always will be, because they're so vital to our understanding of ourselves. If you can capture the narrative with respect to what is liberty, what is freedom, is it Lochner kind of freedom, a Lochner era kind of freedom, where you have a freedom to contract and therefore can stomp on workers' rights? Is it the religious freedom and liberty to discriminate? I mean, there's all that term, these terms of justice, freedom, liberty. These are terms that we have to always battle to define.
Rebecca.
I think if there's really anything that we've seen in the last few years, and everybody on the panel has touched on it in one way or another, is the fact that we really have taken that notion of that, like, my liberty is tied up with all of your liberty. My freedom is tied up with all of your liberty, or your freedom. And while the other side may use those terms, I think we've expanded those terms. I think people talk about using your faith as a sword or a shield. And I think while the other side has been really good about using it as a sword, I think we've sort of gone into phalanx mode, as it were. And as we move forward, the fact that we have each other's backs, we are our siblings' keepers, and we have to be. And I think if there's anything the day after the 2020 election, it's how we maintain that. We have built such, allyship, I was saying earlier, allyship is not a merit badge. We treat it like it is. Oh, you have now been dubbed an ally, now go forth and this will get you a 25% discount at Wendy's or something. But it's work, and it's work that we have to hone ourselves daily to show up for each other, to pull back when we need to pull back, to actively do the work of examining our own internalized racism, homophobia, anti-immigrant sentiment, ableism, et cetera. We can't forget that the day after we get these folks out of office.
And if I could just jump in on that, we saw this in Pittsburgh.
Yeah.
I was in Pittsburgh hours after the massacre, and what I saw in Pittsburgh truly transformed my deeper understanding of what you just described, because what I saw in Pittsburgh was a Muslim community that rushed in, not only to raise hundreds of thousands of dollars for the Jewish families who were mourning, but committed to stand in solidarity outside and protect their Jewish sisters and brothers. And I saw an African-American pastor who spoke at the vigil, who not only named and acknowledged the suffering of the Jews who lost so much, but that the Jewish community had acknowledged that their suffering was bound up with the suffering of the 2 black people who had been murdered in a Kroger's just a couple days before because their church was locked. and 3 years before in Charleston, South Carolina. And that pastor also acknowledged that this synagogue was the highest synagogue, Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, who had committed to work with migrants and refugees and asylum seekers, which is why that white supremacist targeted that synagogue, because they were standing for immigrants. And so when immigrant folk and disabled folk and black folk and white folk and Jewish folk and Muslim folk and all folk come together, that is when we will actually be the civil rights movement that we believe in.
And on that, ladies and gentlemen, please a round of applause for our panel. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.